Haotoru is a dust-brained loser who planned to live out his high school days as a meaningless NPC. His entire life suddenly changes when he develops a crush on a girl with room temperature IQ and pretends to be stupid just to get close enough to smash her cakes. It all started on his very first day in high school. After ignoring all the seniors trying to recruit first years into their clubs, he went to class where a mop-haired nerd named Satoshi tried to make him change his decision to be a miserable loner. He thought their friendship would be enough to stop Haotoru from choosing a sad life of solitude. But then Haotoru showed him an accepted application letter to the Classics Club to shut him up. Satoshi was shocked and couldn't understand why the usually broody loner would sign up for a club on his own until Haotoru gave him a letter from his older sister, who was once a student and wanted him to join the club to save it from getting closed down. Despite still being shocked by Haotoru's decision, Satoshi thought it would be good for him to at least get a private space all to himself since there was no one else in the club. After classes that day, Haotoru grabbed the keys to the clubroom and passed a janitor on the way up before unlocking the door and finding a smoke show hottie named Eru waiting inside. For some reason, she already knew his name, which made absolutely no sense to him until she reminded him of the one music class they shared together. He then asked why she was in the clubroom, and she told him about her decision to join, but when he tried to figure out why, she said it was personal. Seeing that his presence was no longer necessary to keep the club running, he told her to lock up and tried to leave, but she held him back and said she didn't have a key. Surprised, he asked how she got in since he met the door locked, but she claimed it was actually open when she got there and suddenly got all up in his face with a bunch of questions to figure out how. Just then, they realized that Satoshi had been eavesdropping and called him out. He then apologized and defended himself by explaining how unusual it was to see his miserable, ugly friend stuck with a hottie. After getting introduced to Eru, he got shocked and told Haotoru that she was from one of the four most powerful families in their city and was apparently already well known among their peers for having a supercomputer in her brain. With that said, he also admitted to being intrigued by Eru getting locked in the clubroom. Haotoru instinctively knew he was about to get dragged into a pointless investigation, so he tried to leave, but Eru stopped him. She then grabbed his hand to beg for help and charmed him with her brain-melting face card until he accepted and summoned his inner Sherlock Holmes to figure out what happened. After coming up with a bunch of theories in hopes of finding an answer, Eru told them about a weird sound she had been hearing from the ceiling below, and that gave Haotoru all the answers he needed. He immediately took them to the floor below, where the janitor from earlier was switching out the light bulbs of several classes and clubrooms with a master key. That explained how Eru got locked in, but Haotoru still wanted to know how she didn't hear the janitor locking the door, so she took them back up to see an old building she had been focused on the entire time. With their first day officially over, they went down to the locker room, where Eru made Satoshi join the club before they started heading home. The next day, Satoshi told Haotoru about a scary high school legend while he was trying to work on an assignment. As expected, he couldn't care less and only wanted Mr. Yaps a lot to shut the hell up until Satoshi said he heard it from Eru during lunch. Moments later, she showed up with a form Satoshi made her fill out on behalf of the executive committee since she was going to be the club president. She then tried to tell Haotoru about the legend, but he interrupted her to talk about a second one Satoshi was just talking about. Satoshi claimed he heard it from other members of the executive committee and said it was about a mysterious club called the Silk Spider Society that no one had ever been able to find. Eru got excited to learn more about the secret club, and Haotoru immediately matched her freak, so they started by trying to figure out where the club would put up its secret flyer to recruit new members. By feeding off of Eru's supercomputer brain to boost his negative IQ, Haotoru guessed that it would be at the most obvious billboard and found it hidden behind a regular flyer. After playing it cool to make Eru think he was some next-level genius, he started heading home with Satoshi and thanked him for not telling her that the whole thing was a sham he cooked up to avoid solving the original mystery he heard from Eru. When Satoshi asked why he didn't want to solve it, he claimed it was easier than having to deal with her for longer. But Satoshi told him to stop the cap because he could have easily ignored her if he really didn't want her company. Before he could come up with another lie to cover up how badly he wanted to take her for a spin, Satoshi told him to stop acting like he wasn't a simp and left. About a month later, he went to the clubroom to continue his emotionless Sigma charade with the hope that Eru would find it hot and beg for his sausage, but she was too caught up in her own struggle to give their club meaning. After a lot of brainstorming, she decided to have their club do an anthology ahead of the festival, but he refused to do anything that would cause him to use what was left of his 10 kilobyte processing brain. As usual, she got up close to convince him with her beauty, and he folded immediately like the pathetic simp he was, so she dragged him to do some research at the library. Once there, they met Mayaka, a friend of his who knew he was much too stupid to understand anything in the library, and asked why they came. Satoshi was also in the library at the time and teased Mayaka with a claim that she wanted Haoharu's sausage, but she immediately denied wanting anything to do with his baby carrot and said she would never fall for a dust-brained simp who clearly watched too many Batman movies. When Iru finally got around to telling them about the anthology and asked Mayaka for issues done by former members of the club, she said it was locked away in the archives, which meant they would have to wait for the main librarian. To pass the time, Satoshi asked Mayaka to talk about a mystery she brought up earlier, and Haoharu tried to make a run for it, but it was already too late as Iru had become obsessed. Moments later, they were at a table listening to Mayaka talk about a book that had been returned every Friday for the past 5 weeks, which was weird since the library policy allowed books to be held for 2 weeks. Haoharu faked being uninterested again, just so Iru would beg him with her lips inches away from his, but Mayaka interrupted their foreplay because it was disturbing the peace. To solve the mystery, Haoharu needed all the facts, so Mayaka explained that it had been borrowed and returned by 5 different girls around the same time. Haoharu compared the time and knew it was too short to do any sort of reading, so he told them it was definitely being used for something else, and they all racked their brains to figure out what. After coming up with nothing, Haoharu thought the way it was returned might give them some clues, so they went back to the front desk to compare with the other books and still couldn't find anything. Just then, Iru picked up the smell of paint thinner from the book, and Haoharu started considering the fact that she might literally be a but he also realized what the answer might be and took them all the way to the art club where a bunch of girls had drawn portraits with the book. The girls tried to compliment Haoharu on finally doing something with the little brain matter left in his skull, but their gorgeous faces almost made him lose control, so they went back to the library to give Satoshi the news. Haoharu immediately tried to leave so they wouldn't see his brick, but Iru called him back because they still had the anthology thing. Thankfully, the librarian Yuko finally showed up, so they asked her for the past issues, but she claimed there were none kept in the archives and left. With no real reason to keep staying, Haoharu headed straight home to enjoy a typical introvert's weekend, but Iru called him just after sunrise that Sunday to ask for a meetup. Afterwards, he waited at a coffee place until she showed up breathing like she just finished a marathon and apologized for being late. Moments later, she ordered something, and he asked why she called him out, but she started playing dumb, so he got up to leave because her hot bod was not enough reason to give up the peaceful silence of his house. After she apologized with puppy eyes, he folded as usual and sat down to hear what she claimed was a confession that was making her nervous. Every fiber of his being wanted to hear her say that she was in love with him, but after a long silence, she asked for his help remembering something really personal. Her uncle went to India 7 years ago and had been missing ever since, but long before that, sometime in kindergarten, she heard that he was in the classics club and asked him a question about it, but he refused to give her an answer. She kept bugging him over that one question until he gave her an answer and simply watched as it made her cry uncontrollably without comforting her like he always would. She told Haoharu that she desperately wanted to remember what that answer was and why he acted so strange after telling it to her, but he was more confused about why it was suddenly so important. After explaining that it was the main reason why she joined the Classics Club, she told him about a funeral service about to be held for him since missing people were typically recorded to have kicked the bucket after 7 years. She wanted to remember what he said before then as a way to feel closer to him, but Haoharu claimed it was none of his business and refused to help. Seeing that his usual nonchalant act wasn't working this time, he asked why she specifically asked him and not her other friends, despite knowing that she already considered him to be a dollar store Sherlock Holmes. She then stroked his ego and told him how his recently increased brain power could finally give her some closure on the matter, so he accepted and promised to help her with everything, including the amnesia that caused her to forget. The next week at school was the midterms, so their usual club activity was put on hold, but on the very last day, he got back home and saw a new letter from his sister. She told him about life abroad, but also wanted to ask if he had done an anthology yet and wrote about a safe at the clubroom that had all the past issues from previous sets that were in the club. The very next day, he gave the letter to Mayaka and Iru, but they had not seen a safe since joining the club, so he reminded them that his sister graduated 2 years ago and the clubroom's location had changed since then. Luckily, he had already asked around, and knew where its last location was, so the girls left to check it out, but he sat back just so Iru would have to drag him along again. On the way there, he saw what looked like makeshift sensors before the girls found the club room locked and knocked as they could hear someone inside. Moments later, Masashi came out, and Haotoru could smell enough axe spray to choke out an entire civilization. Once he realized who Eru was, Masashi got jumpy and asked why they were at his club, so the girls told him about the safe and asked if they could take a look, but he claimed it had never been there. Mayaka then pulled Haotoru aside to ask if he noticed Masashi's weird behavior before they both reminded him that the club room was still technically open to whoever wanted to look, according to the school's rules. Once inside, Haotoru noticed the fan that was weirdly placed directly in front of a piece Masashi claimed to be working on, despite the window bringing in enough air, but he ignored it to help the girls look. After they failed to find anything, he asked Masashi if he moved out anything large when he first joined in his year, but he could only remember tossing a few cardboard boxes. Haotoru then said something about calling a supervisor to conduct a thorough search in the club room, but Masashi suddenly went off the rails and told them to leave. Before doing that, Haotoru explained exactly how the anthology should look and told him they would be at the library for the next couple of minutes, just in case he magically happened to see the issues laying around somewhere. Several minutes later, they left the library and met the anthology issues stacked on the table in their club room, so Mayaka asked how he did it. After making her promise to keep it a secret, he told her about the makeshift sensors and said Masashi had set them up to know when someone was close so he could cover up his addiction to the za with body spray. Being a senior meant he could get expelled from school and probably disowned by his family, which was why he got pissed when Haotoru said they would call a supervisor because the safe was under the fake table the entire time and was where he probably hid his stash. Mayaka had just finished calling Haotoru a creep when Satoshi came in dressed like a sunflower activist and got excited to hear the news. Just then, Iru pulled Haotoru aside to show him the second anthology issue and said it was what she asked her uncle about all those years ago because it had something about him written inside. The issue was written a year after he left the school and spoke of him being known as a hero of some sorts, despite actually being far from it. So Haotoru asked Eru why she still seemed upset, and she said the answer he gave her had still not come back. She wanted to know exactly what her uncle did, so he suggested reading the first issue since that was from the year he was still a student. But then Mayaka said that very issue was missing. On the way home that evening, Haotoru told her to consider telling the others about it so they could help out, but she refused until he explained that both of their low IQ brains would be too slow to figure out what happened. At the club the next day, she told Satoshi and Mayaka about it and agreed to meet up at her place over the weekend after doing their own research. That Saturday, Satoshi proudly showed off his fruity side, and Haotoru tried to deny knowing him, but the damage had already been done, so they both rode their bikes across town until they found the massive estate belonging to Iru's family. Moments later, she welcomed them into her not-so-humble abode and gave them a little tour to rub in how rich her family was before they got to the meeting room where Mayaka was already waiting. After getting seated, Iru gave them all a copy of the preface from the second anthology because it was the only page with some information about what happened to her uncle. From what she read, he got expelled from their high school 45 years ago over a fight that was significant enough to turn him into a local legend the very next year when the second anthology was written. She had also read that it happened right around the yearly school festival and came up with a theory after a close friend told her about some bandits that robbed stands at the festival. She suspected that her uncle probably fought off a similar group of delinquents back in the day, which was how he got expelled and became a legend, but both Satoshi and Haotoru said it wouldn't have been possible since there were little to no cases of such violence in the late 90s when her uncle was in school. Next up was Mayaka, but Satoshi started asking too many questions about Iru's estate. So she took them to a porch with an amazing view so he could feast his eyes while discussing the theory. After giving them copies of an exposé, she told them about a riot that happened in the year Iru's uncle got expelled. It was some sort of protest between the student body and their teachers at the time, who enforced a new policy that changed things for all the students. Mayaka was convinced that Iru's uncle probably led the protest and got violent with his teachers, which was why he got expelled, but Haotoru said she was also wrong because the protest happened months before he got expelled. Next up was Satoshi, but his appetite became a problem, so they went back in to keep talking about their theories while Iru cooked up some rice balls. After she served them, Satoshi handed out issues of their high school's newspaper from around the time Iru's uncle was a student, and from what it said, the protest was a non-violent one, which meant there was never a clash with the teachers that could lead to Iru's uncle getting expelled. They then compared the results of their research and hoped Haotoru's slow brain could come up with something. But he was already tired of the entire thing and acted dumb, so they would stop pestering him. Just then, it started to rain, and Iru remembered something she had left out to dry, so Haotoru used that as an opportunity to relieve his filled-up bladder. Being used to living in the Matrix made it difficult to navigate her mansion, and he eventually ended up in her room, where she had laid out a bunch of papers she was using for extra research on what happened. When he eventually found the bathroom, he decided to channel his inner Sherlock Holmes and arrange all the facts to figure out the answer. Moments later, they were all back at the table and eagerly listened as he told them that there was probably a good reason why Iru's uncle got expelled months after the protest. From what they had gathered, there was definitely a protest involving the entire student body about some new policy the teachers made, and it seemed to be connected to the festival. With Iru's uncle leading the students in the protest, the school's authorities eventually decided to give in to their demands and permitted the festival to go on for the 5 days initially proposed by the student body. To avoid another protest, they then waited a couple of months and expelled Iru's uncle just after the festival so no one would really notice. With the case finally solved, Iru thanked them all for the help and sent them back to their lives in the suburbs. On the way out of her estate, Satoshi kept pestering Haotoru about how he secretly had it bad for Iru, but he denied having feelings again and claimed that he was sacrificing his peaceful life as an introvert just to show how kind he was. After getting home later on, he spent most of the night struggling to accept his own feelings and eventually decided to call his sister and distract himself. Their conversation took a turn when he told her about their investigation into what happened to Iru's uncle, Sekitani, and got shocked when she said something about the entire incident being a tragedy. Before he could ask any more questions, she hung up the phone and left him stressing over how his theory wasn't complete. The next day, he called the rest of the gang for a meeting at the clubroom, where he told them what happened and gave them a few minutes to verbally assault him for thinking his dust-filled brain could solve mysteries faster than the actual Sherlock Holmes. He then told them about the phone call and brought out the preface they got from the second anthology issue. The new goal was to know if Sekitani willingly sacrificed himself for his mates by getting expelled or was just used as a scapegoat. To figure that out, Satoshi said the only way would be finding whoever wrote the preface, but Haotoru was already a few steps ahead and told him it was the same Yuko working as the head librarian. In a matter of minutes, they were all at the library to see her, and Mayaka handled restocking the shelves so Haotoru and the others could ask about the preface and their theories. After admitting to being the one who wrote it and realizing that Sekitani was Iru's uncle, she took them into her office and commended Haotoru on being smart enough to figure out most of the story on his own. To answer their question about what exactly happened, she took them back in time to that very year when a festival was still the best thing to happen to kids their age. That year, the school authorities randomly decided to reduce the festival from 5 to 2 days, and that was what triggered protests from the entire student body. Despite being bold enough to make their voices heard, none of them was bold enough to lead the movement out of a fear of punishment. But Sekitani ended up being the pawn chosen to pose as the leader by another student no one else really knew. Things took a turn when they started taking the protests a lot more seriously and ended up burning down the old martial arts building, which then forced the school's authorities to demand a scapegoat instead of making the matter public. Unfortunately, that turned out to be Sekitani, who was then expelled after the festival to keep any other protests at bay. That was all Yuko knew about the incident, and it seemed like enough to close the case, but there was still the question of whether Sekitani willingly sacrificed himself for the cause or got abandoned by his mates. To solve that, Haotoru decided to focus on the art used on the cover page of all the anthology issues and Sekitani's weird decision to name it Hioka. A quick translation made him realize that Hioka, which usually means ice cream, was a pun Sekitani used to cover up his pain. One look at Haotoru's translation cured Iru's amnesia, causing her to remember that Sekitani actually told her that he was sacrificed by his peers, who were all too spineless to own up to their own mistakes. Iru struggled to hold back the tears and thanked Haotoru for finally helping her remember what happened. But he acted like it was all in a day's work to make her think he was some kind of alpha. A couple of days later, Haotoru was in class, struggling to understand what the teacher was yapping about when everyone else started hearing what sounded like an argument between Iru and her teacher in the next class. In the clubroom later that day, she found Mayaka about to rupture Satoshi's eardrums with her screaming and tried to calm her down, but she only got a lot louder until Haotoru calmly threatened to cut her tongue out. Mayaka immediately sat down like she was his little bitch, and they all started talking about the effects of getting angry since they had nothing meaningful to accomplish with their pathetic lives. They mostly focused on how Eru always seemed to have her emotions under control, and Satoshi suggested anger management classes to Mayaka so she could get her temporary psychosis under control. Tired of listening to their pointless conversation, Haotoru asked Eru about the argument he heard between her and a teacher, but the sudden look of curiosity in her eyes made him regret ever bringing it up in the first place. He immediately tried to leave, but she held his bag and said it was something important. He already knew it was going to be another pointless investigation and still decided to stay since he never really had a sense of self-respect. With their low-budget Sherlock Holmes convinced, Eru explained that the teacher in question came in like always to teach them math, but unlike the usual lessons, he gave them a problem they had not been taught about yet. He also asked a bunch of them for the answers and got upset when no one could give him a response until Eru stood up to argue it out, and he realized that he had skipped ahead in the curriculum. Both Eru and Satoshi knew the math teacher was much too organized to make such a mistake and told Haotoru to figure out why it happened. So he said the teacher probably just missed a day, but even Mayaka said it was impossible and told him to stop trying to escape having to put his worthless brain cells to work. While talking about the curriculum with them, Satoshi confessed to still not being smart enough to understand the math problem, even though his class had already gotten past that part of the curriculum. That statement gave Haotoru an idea, so he laid out a bunch of snacks shaped like letters and reminded them that each teacher had notes specific to the arrangement of their classes. With Satoshi being in Class A and Eru in D, he realized that the teacher got the notes mixed up because he definitely wrote his letters in lowercase. Once again, Eru got up close to thank Haotoru with a kiss, but he managed to keep up his Sigma act while secretly wishing Satoshi and Mayaka would leave so he could take Eru to Pound Town. Unfortunately, the toxic lovebirds were clueless and kept interrupting, so he gave up and joined them to head home. Days later, Haotoru was on a bus with Satoshi and the girls heading to a village popular for its hot springs after Eru came up with the idea as a proper way of thanking them for solving the mystery surrounding her uncle's expulsion. By the time they got there, Haotoru was already struggling to keep his food down, so Mayaka took them to an inn run by her relatives, and they got introduced to her cousins, Rie and Keo. Moments later, he and Satoshi went to check out their rooms, and Haotoru tried to act like having scenic views was a normal part of his life, but Satoshi told him to be a little more grateful to the girls for finally giving him a taste of life outside the Matrix. Close to sundown, he decided to head to a hot spring and saw that Eru had the same idea, so they walked together and talked a lot about Eru's dreams of having siblings before getting there. After getting changed, he tried to finally get some peace in the bath, but Satoshi was already there and started his free behavior to piss Haotoru off. He tried to distract himself, but then he heard Eru getting into the girl's bath and started visualizing an intense gymning session until he got dizzy and had to be carried back by Satoshi. About an hour later, Eru went to check on him, but her touch gave him instant brick, so he turned to hide and said he was okay so she would leave. After she did, he overheard them telling stories about a mysterious client that booked a stay in the inn and sent himself to the Grim Reaper. His room had been the topic of many rumors since then, and apparently even gave another client a mysterious illness, so Mayaka's relatives left it closed off and started renovating the place to clear up the rumors. Several minutes later, Haotoru got tired of hearing them talk and decided to shut the window, but then he saw one of Mayaka's cousins leaving and ignored it to protect his sanity. The next morning, he left Satoshi soaking in a pool of his own drool to have a normal day with the girls, but that plan crashed the moment Mayaka came out looking like she had seen the devil and claimed the ghost of the mysterious client was hanging in the same room throughout the night. When they got seated for breakfast, he tried to get a cup of tea and saw that Rie had labeled her cup, so he took another and listened as they all tried to make sense of what Mayaka saw. He then noticed that Eru was acting strange and checked in with her, so she told him that she had seen the exact same thing while Mayaka was her pants. He tried to say that it was probably something else, but that made the girls a lot more curious and led to another investigation. After breakfast, he took Eru back to his room to ask if the window from the mysterious room was open around the time they finished telling each other scary stories, and she said they had been closed up until the time Mayaka first saw the ghost. To get more answers, they went to that part of the building and asked Keo if she could take them to the room, but she said it was off limits to anyone but the family, and claimed to be busy to avoid other questions. On the way out, they found the room used for exercise and saw that Ri also labeled her own ball before heading out and realizing that it rained the previous night. They had just seen that the window on the other side was closed when Ko called them for lunch where Satoshi was waiting to get looped in. After Ri came in to show off her yukata, they complimented her and got back to the usual small talk until Haotoru sensed someone watching and decided to visit the hot springs again. Like before, Satoshi had the same idea and asked him a bunch of questions to be sure he wouldn't pass out again, but somewhere along the line of their conversation, Satoshi told him about a festival that happened the previous night and led him to realize what actually happened. Moments later, he got out and met Eru outside, so they walked back together, and he told her the ghost was actually a yukata that somebody secretly hung out to dry. Ko was jealous of Ri's yukata and decided to sneak out with it for the festival the previous night, but the rain got it soaked, so she opened the windows of the only room not in use and hung it out to dry so she could put it back early the next day. Solving the mystery didn't make Eru as excited because she realized that the sisters were probably not on good terms, but then they saw Ri carrying Ko back home, and that gave her hope again. Days later, Haotoru and Satoshi made it to school and saw a bunch of students already making preparations ahead of the festival, so they talked about how far they had come since the day he first met Eru in the clubroom. That conversation reminded Satoshi that they would have a meeting with the girls, so they tried to get there in time, but Mayaka made it there first and kept running her mouth like a mother struggling with a midlife crisis. Thankfully, Eru showed up and saved them by talking about a friend of hers who had put together a movie with her class and wanted to get their opinion ahead of the festival. Once they got to the class where Fuyumi was waiting to greet them, Satoshi immediately tried to test out his Riz game by claiming they had once met, but Fuyumi denied ever knowing the shameless simp and ignored him to talk about the movie. Unlike Satoshi, Haotoru didn't even want to be there and asked why they had to be the ones reviewing Fuyumi's movie, but they didn't really care about his opinion in the matter, so he sat his stupid down and waited for Fuyumi to play it. What started out as a movie about a bunch of kids on a trip took a very cliché turn when they found an abandoned building and thought it would be a good idea to spend the night inside. After two of them found the regular keys and intentionally left the master key behind, they shared it and went to find rooms clean enough to sleep in. Moments later, they got back and realized that one of them was missing, so they looked through all the other rooms until they found one locked. With the master key from earlier, they got in and saw the missing classmate in a pool of his insides and also saw his arm by the door with a key. After one of them looked out the window for clues and found something interesting in a corner, the movie ended and Fuyumi asked if they could solve the murder. Haotoru immediately asked why she was too lazy to do it on her own and also still wanted to know why she specifically asked for their club instead of finishing the movie on her own. After saying she had heard about their investigation into the anthology series and thought they could figure out who did it, she told them the movie was actually incomplete because the scriptwriter fell ill after writing the last scene they watched. She wanted their help in figuring out the culprit, but they all knew Haotoru was the low-budget Sherlock Holmes and tried to convince him. The attention-seeking fake alpha said it was too much of a responsibility to figure it out on their own, so Fuyumi told him about some of her mates that were also coming up with theories and asked if they could at least listen to them. Before Haotoru could refuse, Eru worked her magic and folded his self-respect like a pretzel. The next day, the scorching heat made him second-guess going to school, but Eru pulled up to force him out so they could get to the clubroom in time for the investigation. Moments later, a shy midget named Kurako showed up and escorted them to a class to see the wannabe detectives. After introductions, the gang got seated, and Kurako left with two of the wannabes so they could start with Junya, the assistant director who was clearly too old for his grade and probably picked up the position to make up for constantly flunking classes. Before getting started, Eru handed out a bunch of whiskey-flavored chocolates her family was trying to promote, but while they all got repulsed by its taste, she liked it and kept munching. Over the next couple of minutes, Junya kept running his mouth about how difficult it was to be an assistant director until they got tired of listening and asked for his theory. According to the master flunker, the culprit got in through the window to commit the crime and left the exact same way since the floor plans of the building showed that it was impossible to get in through the door or the blocked passageway. Mayaka was not satisfied with his theory and reminded him that there were no footprints on the grass that would suggest an escape or break-in, but Junya's dust-filled brain stopped him from seeing the logic, and he left thinking he was some sort of detective in the making. After telling them that Junya's theory was horse crap because the culprit would have easily been spotted by all the other students who were on the floor above, Haotoru called Kurako to ask for the movie's script before Tomohiro came in to show off his detective skills. Without wasting any time, he pulled out the building's floor plan to rule out any possibility of the victim getting clapped by one of his mates who got the master key, since they would have been spotted crossing the lobby to reach it. He then brought out a rope and said the scriptwriter specifically asked for it, which proved that one of the victim's mates got in through the window from the floor above. Haotoru was curious to know if the scriptwriter had any other demands, so Tomohiro brought out 2 bottles of prop blood and said the scriptwriter asked for the smaller one, but they ended up using the larger one without consulting her. After he left to let them soak in his genius, Haotoru said his prop-stuffed brain was clearly too corroded to see that the window was old, which made it impossible for the culprit to get inside and clap the victim without being seen. Moments later, Kurako gave them the script before Misaki came in to blow their minds with her perfect theory. Unlike her slow associates, she knew it would have been impossible for one of the victim's mates to pull it off, which meant there was another hidden character that was probably going to reveal himself by clapping them one after the other until 2 of them would find love and escape. Haotoru tried to ask for some kind of evidence to back up her theory, but Misaki turned out to be the worst of the bunch because she had just cooked up the theory after inhaling half a kilo of nose candy. After she left, Iru tried to make a point, but the box of whiskey chocolates she had been eating finally short-circuited her brain. The 3 of them carefully compared all the theories with the actual script and told Kurako they were all wrong before Mayaka carried Iru home. After the usual small talk with Satoshi about the true size of their baby carrots, they both started heading home, but Haotoru ran into Fuyumi, who wanted to have a chat over tea. Moments later, they were at a cafe, and he was struggling to explain being too broke to afford a cup of tea, but she told him not to worry since it wasn't her first time going out with a simp stuck in the Matrix. She then told him that the real reason she asked for their club was because she had heard about his ability to solve complex cases and needed him to figure out what the scriptwriter had planned because he was special. Those words lit up his entire world, but he played it cool to act like her words were not strong enough to penetrate his dark heart. Unfortunately for our top-ranked virgin, Fuyumi knew how to play with his inexperienced mind and told him a story about talent to make him obey her command like a good little simp. The very next day, he called Satoshi out for a meeting in the clubroom, which was weird since they were already on summer break, and Satoshi knew he wouldn't give up a holiday for no good reason. Once they got there, even Mayaka could tell that something was off about him and immediately guessed that Fuyumi had worked her magic on him before telling them that Iru was probably still sleeping off the chocolate overdose. They then spent the following minutes rewatching the entire movie to find new clues and started getting flustered because the sheer lack of talent was getting them migraines. Just then, one of Satoshi's buddies showed up to remind him of the makeup test he had to take as a result of being too slow to keep up with the rest of the class. His lack of testosterone made it difficult to fight off Yamauchi, so he gave Mayaka the notes he had taken for the case so they could figure it out together. With Satoshi gone, Mayaka said she had no intention of staying around Haotoru's negative aura personality and left him with the notes so he could figure it out on his own. Being alone finally gave him enough time to fully activate his brain cells for a deep dive into the movie that finally gave him the answers they had all been searching for. Several minutes later, Fuyumi answered his call and eagerly listened as he started by first saying that the culprit was none of the other kids because the window was too old for a smooth entry and the lobby too exposed for the master key plan. He then said Misaki was right because there was an extra character, but unlike the serial killer she mentioned, it was actually the cameraman, which perfectly explained why the entire movie looked like a low-quality recording. The cameraman was actually a part of the group who was treated like a stagehand and decided to get his revenge by taking the master key after they all went inside and clapping the victim before they could figure out what happened. Fuyumi acknowledged his genius and also pointed out that it would be pretty obvious since the cameraman was the only one left in the lobby, but Haotoru said the scriptwriter was most likely aiming for a bit of curiosity from the viewers and didn't really care about the finale. With that, Fuyumi thanked him for the help, and a couple of days later, they all went to watch it play out in her class. Once the movie was over, Satoshi and the girls gave him props for solving another case, but after Iru and Satoshi left, Mayaka pulled him aside to ask about the rope Tomohiro said the scriptwriter had asked for, and Haotoru immediately realized that something was off. Seeing the way Haotoru responded to getting something wrong, Mayaka changed the topic and claimed she really liked the ending of the movie before leaving. Moments later, Haotoru was heading to the locker room, but Satoshi stopped him to say the exact same thing. This time, Haotaru desperately tried to make his theory sound like the true ending until Satoshi told him to accept his own incompetence and left. Once he got to the locker room, Iru showed up, and he instinctively knew what she wanted to say, so they took a walk to talk about it. Iru could sense that he was already beating himself up over it, so she took him to the side of a river to make sure he was calm before explaining just how wrong he was. She believed that the scriptwriter wanted a different ending because the description Fuyumi gave them made her sound like a shy person who never really liked violence and didn't even pay close attention to other mystery movies. After realizing just how wrong he was, Haotaru spent the rest of the day brooding and eventually read a book that made him realize where it all went wrong. The next day, he waited for Fuyumi along the path she would usually take and asked her for a chat over tea. Thankfully, he had saved up to clear the tab for once and asked why she lied about him being a talented detective when she just wanted someone to be her scriptwriter. He had figured that the scriptwriter's initial story was definitely a boring one judging by the amount of blood Tomohiro said she requested for. And Fuyumi made her fake an illness so she could send the rest of the class, as well as Haotaru, into a secret contest disguised as a search for the truth when it was really just her way of comparing their theories to see which one would make the movie better. With that said, he demanded to know why she lied about him having talent just to make him do what she wanted, but she blamed him for lacking experience with women and being too gullible to realize that he was being played. A few days later, he got ready for school, but his sister stopped him at the door to ask about his plans for the festival and gave him a spoiled pen for good luck. On the way there, he met Satoshi, who was excited to spend the festival with members of his other clubs, and told him to try letting loose for once so he could actually have a good time. He then saw Mayaka in cosplay and went to compliment her look, but the short-fused midget wasn't used to getting compliments and stopped him from saying anything else. After getting to school and taking the time to look through all the other clubs and what they had planned, Satoshi ditched them to meet his other friends, so Haotaru went up with Mayaka and met Iru inside the club room. Although she was excited for the festival, they already had an issue with the anthologies they had printed out and waited for Satoshi to get back from his astronomy club. Once he showed up and ruined the headpiece, the girls explained that they had accidentally ordered a lot more copies, and they now had to sell to about 300 students despite being the most unpopular club in the entire school. They then came up with a plan for Iru to ask for a new booth from the council president, while Satoshi and Mayaka would talk about the anthologies in their other clubs. Haotaru offered to watch their booth in the meantime, so the three musketeers went to attend the opening ceremony. Once it was finished, Iru went to find the council president but got distracted by the other booths and activities. After remembering the original mission, she went to the office and kept knocking until a four-eyed nerd named Tanabet tried to riz her up. She almost cussed him out, but he turned out to be the vice council president, so she explained what happened, and he suggested sharing copies of the anthology with other clubs, because it was too late to change locations. While Satoshi was literally laughing his socks off, Mayaka went to her club to get customers, but they clowned her for picking out her cosplay from the Lost and Found. At the time, Haotaru was at the booth enjoying his peace and quiet, but it ended when a human hedgehog came in to ask about the club. After deciding to buy one of the anthologies for some reason, he saw the pen Haotaru got from his sister and wouldn't shut up about how good it would look with his Balenciaga outfit, so Haotaru told him to take it. In return, he gave Haotaru a backstage pass to his club's fashion show and promised him a makeover if he decided to show up. Once he left, Haotaru went back to being the embodiment of depression. Meanwhile, Iru was still getting distracted by every other club and realized that she probably had ADHD. The second day of the festival started out with a quiz that got all the students hyped, so Satoshi joined and managed to snag a win that got him into the finals. Just as he was about to go on stage, an old friend named Tani stopped him to catch up and tried to tell him about something weird going on in the festival, but Satoshi got called up at the last moment and left him to go tell everyone about the anthology series. At the time, Iru had just got back from visiting every booth again and apologized for being utterly useless, but Haotaru told her not to even bother since Satoshi's little show was probably enough to get the word out. That suddenly gave her an idea, so she went straight to Masashi and asked if he could put up a piece about the anthology in his club's newspapers, but he said it was pointless since the other relevant clubs would be treated with more importance than their group of wannabe detectives. After apologizing for wasting his time, she ran into a friend named Kaho, who invited her into a tent for a reading and apologized for not having the regular tarot card because there was apparently a festival thief taking random items from people's booths and leaving a card. By then, Satoshi's quiz contest had just come to an end, so he tried to leave, but Tani stopped him again to tell him about the festival thief that had also taken something from his club and left a note. Satoshi claimed it was probably just a prankster messing with them, so Tani dropped the topic and challenged him to a cook-off scheduled for the next day. Meanwhile, Haotoru was in the club room looking through Iru's photos until a weirdo walked in with an AK and asked for a copy of the anthology. After taking his money, Haotoru pointed out his open sausage, but the gunslinger had already ruined his zipper, so Haotoru gave him the pin from his backstage pass and got a water gun in return. Shortly after that, Mayaka was in her club room struggling with low self-confidence while listening to one of the seniors named Ayako run her mouth about how manga series were only as good as their fanbase. At a certain point, Mayaka got tired of hearing her nonsense and found the balls to say that she was wrong, but Ayako refused to take advice from an otaku that was clearly too broke to get a proper cosplay outfit. Mayaka then promised to bring a very special manga from home so Ayako could read it and realize that there were a lot of underrated manga series better than the ones she was used to. Later on, the gang got back to Haotoru at the club room to discuss their progress, but Satoshi was more concerned about the cooking contest because he just realized that he needed a team of 3 people. With no options left, he begged the girls for their help and was lucky enough to convince them, so he left with Mayaka to discuss recipes, while Iru saw that Haotoru looked through her festival pics and had an extremely awkward moment with him. After getting home, Mayaka spent hours searching for the manga she told Ayako about and realized that she had lost it. The next day, she apologized to all the seniors for running her mouth, but they didn't give two shits about her apology and told her to work on making new posters as a punishment. Moments later, she explained what happened to Satoshi, so he came up with a plan to make her the last cook on the team before running off to have a chat with Tanabe, who had also been hearing about the festival thief and thought it was worth looking into. Not long after that, Haotoru was back in the club room waiting for the next client. But this time, it was 2 girls obsessed with Halloween, and they traded him some cookies and a bag of flour for the water gun and an anthology. Moments later, Tani showed up to the contest with a professional chef to get Satoshi worked up, but he was already dealing with missing a teammate and eagerly waited for the contest to kick off so he could channel his inner Gordon Ramsay. Once he was done with the first part, Iru took over and wasted no time in showing off her wifey skills, but when the timer ran out, Satoshi looked like he was about to pass out and reminded her that they were meant to leave some ingredients for Mayaka. At the time, she had just finished with the posters and ran as fast as she could to make it to the contest, but it was already too late since she only had a bunch of vegetables to work with. As the timer started counting down, they thought it was already over, but Haotoru suddenly called out to Satoshi from the club room and tossed in the bag of flour he got from the Halloween addicts. With that, Mayaka started cooking as fast as she could, but she had to stop again after realizing that the ladle was missing and waited until the host could get a new one. With seconds on the clock, she activated beast mode and actually managed to finish her Michelin star dish in time, ultimately securing the win against all the other teams. After celebrating their win, the host apologized for the missing ladle and said they had actually kept one before the contest started, so Iru went to take a look and saw a card from the festival thief. After getting back to the club room and thanking Haotoru for the last-minute save, Iru showed him the card and hoped that would be enough to get him interested. Realizing that he had gotten used to her face, she joined forces with Satoshi and Mayaka to make him think that solving the case would also help the club get more anthology sales, but Haotoru said it would be impossible as there were thousands of people attending the festival. To make them feel better, he asked about the other clubs that had been attacked and made them realize that the thief was choosing clubs in alphabetical order. After also looking at the signature left on the card, he said it was the initials of the thief's hit list, which would mean that their club was likely going to be hit last. With that, Iru ran off to get their club's name in the newspaper, while Satoshi claimed to have something else to do before running off. While Haotoru only had about 5 seconds of silence before Mayaka started taking out her daddy issues on him, Iru was already at Masashi's club and pulled him aside to melt his brain with her beauty. Unfortunately, the stoner's mind was too baked for regular techniques, so he tried to leave, but when she mentioned something about the thief, he suddenly got interested, so she told him everything she knew about it. He also told her about the item that was stolen from his club and thanked her for the information before leaving. She was just about heading back when Satoshi bumped into her and started running his mouth about all the clues he had gathered to catch the thief. Before she could say anything, he left to visit the Magic Club since they were next on the hit list, but Tani was also there and claimed he was the only one smart enough to figure out the truth. At the time, Mayaka had just gotten up to leave the club room, but Haotoru stopped her to ask for any random items she had as payment for the flower, so she tried breaking his nose with a mirror and left. Moments later, Satoshi went in to watch the Magic Club's show, and Fuyumi also had the same idea, but she kept a seat in between them to keep his inexperienced mind from getting any ideas. Just as they started the performance, a candle went missing, and Satoshi realized how stupid he was for thinking the thief would wait until the middle of the show to pull off a heist. By then, Mayaka was back in her manga club, but Ariyoshi and her girls were clowning her for forgetting the manga she was making such a fuss about until their seniors got back and told the girls to stop talking like fatherless bops. Moments later, Mayaka stepped out to get some air, but one of the seniors named Shoko joined her to talk about the same manga. She knew one of the authors, and Mayaka got curious to know more about them, but that was all Shoko had to tell her, so she went back to sulking. Not long after that, Satoshi went back to the club room and told Haotoru about his epic fail before Eru also got back and told them that Masashi had written about their club being a likely target, which could help them get more anthology sales. The next day, Satoshi went a little earlier than everyone else to get the drop on the festival thief, but Tani and a couple of other wannabes had the same idea as well. Meanwhile, Haotoru was in the club room going over their sales and realized that their arresting efforts were starting to pay off. Moments later, his sister came in to see him and bought a copy before trading Mayaka's mirror for the same manga she had been looking for. At the time, Satoshi and the pretend detectives were at a new club scoping the scenery out, but after a few hours of no action, they got bored and started leaving right before Tani got a call and told Satoshi that the thief took something from the music club. While he was dealing with being a failure again, Iru went to see Yoshino, the president of the broadcast club, to ask if he could say something about the club on the next broadcast, but he was already ecstatic and said they had been trying to get an interview ever since everyone realized that the classic club was on the hit list. After that, she went back to the club room to tell the boys, but right as Haotoru finished the manga from his sister, Iru got curious and asked for it. Seeing that as an opportunity, he held it back so she would reach in close enough for a kiss, but right as it was about to happen, he chickened out and gave it to her. Moments later, Mayaka was at her club working on a couple of posters, but one of the girls suddenly faked a slip-up and threw paint water all over her outfit. Too fed up to say a word, she simply got up and went to get changed before bumping into Iru outside the club and seeing the manga. Iru then told her that she had seen a drawing similar to the artist's style on the festival flyer, so they immediately went to ask Hanabe, who told them it was the current council president. When they both got back and told the boys about it, Haotoru started piecing a lot of things together and thought he should tell them about a theory. But knowing how the girls would react, he asked for a bit of Satoshi's time. After getting to an open space, Haotoru started listing out all the weird facts they had gotten from the case so far and felt the whole thing had been planned right from the previous year and was connected to the manga he got from his sister. The writers had left a message announcing a new series that was going to be released during the current festival, and all the thefts of almost meaningless items made it look like the whole thing was just their way of creating a new mystery book. Satoshi acted like Haotoru's theory was not a big deal and left to get back to his investigation. But he couldn't stop himself from accepting the truth about how talentless he was. Meanwhile, Iru had just gotten on the broadcast club's radio show and tried to keep herself calm, but that ended horribly when she slammed her empty brain into the sound system. With the help of a few notes she prepared earlier on, she managed to stay on top of the situation and invited the other students to the club room as they had planned to set up a manuscript in hopes that it would lead to the festival thief getting captured. Afterwards, almost everyone turned up, and the anthologies started selling out in a matter of minutes. But after what felt like eons of waiting for the festival thief to strike, everyone started suspecting them of cooking up the entire thing as a publicity stunt for their useless club. Just as Haotoru tried to get a stretch in, Satoshi's phone rang and distracted them all right before the manuscript got blown up. After Satoshi put out the fire, Mayaka found a card from the thief, showing that they had all been bamboozled again. Not long after that, Satoshi met up with Tani, who then promised to beat him at the next cook-off and left so he could have some time alone with Mayaka. She tried to console him for not having enough talent to match Haotoru's Sherlock Holmes skills, but the real source of his pain was something that happened much earlier that day. He was spying on Haotoru and overheard him accusing Tanabe of being the festival thief. Naturally, Tanabe asked for his evidence, so Haotoru got to work and listed out all the clues that gave him away. The most significant was how it all tied back to the manga that the council president drew last year with another student who transferred. It turned out Tanabe knew about the manga and didn't like that the council president was not interested in drawing anymore, which was why he started the entire plan to see if it would make him feel guilty for ignoring his talent. Instead of ratting him out to everyone else, Haotoru told him to buy 30 copies of the anthology and put it up on the festival website in exchange for keeping his secret and helping him complete the mission. Tanabe didn't understand how he planned to help, so Haotoru told him about the manuscript that would be placed at the center of the clubroom and promised to add some sodium in between the sheets so he could cause an explosion with a water gun. Haotoru also expected a lot of students to show up, thanks to Iru's broadcast, and said he would give a big stretch as a signal, to which Tanabe would respond by calling Satoshi's phone and using that distraction to blow up the manuscript before dropping one of the anthologies with his card inside. Later that day, the council president held the closing ceremony for the festival before Satoshi and Mayaka got back to the clubroom and saw that only a handful of the anthologies were left. After buying the copies, they all got excited, and Iru finally wanted to focus on solving the festival thief mystery with Haotoru. But Satoshi told her to chill out so they could plan a proper celebration after school. Days later, they were all back in the clubroom wasting another 24 hours on a pointless conversation. But a chopper suddenly flew by, so Satoshi went to take a look since he had only ever seen them on TV. Hearing the blade spin reminded Haotoru of a certain teacher named Oji who was obsessed with helicopters. But when he asked if they remembered him from middle school, Satoshi and Mayaka asked if he had finally fried his last remaining brain cells on the hub. Afraid of being labeled as a yapping psycho, he told them the full story of a day when Ovi stopped in the middle of a lecture to watch a chopper fly by and forced a smile with his old man dentures. While Mayaka easily remembered seeing that, Satoshi still thought something was off because he also remembered the day a squad of choppers flew by, but Oji didn't respond to them. He then told them about a wild story he once heard from Oji, who claimed he survived 3 lightning strikes, although they never actually hit him directly. Haotoru knew there was no way a senior citizen like Oji had enough brain power to come up with a fake story claiming he was a low-budget Thor, and started giving the entire thing some thought before suddenly asking if the public library kept old newspapers. After Satoshi said they did, Haotoru asked if he wanted to come with, but Satoshi got terrified and started checking up on him because he was known for being a chronically lazy sack of bones who would never choose to do anything. Mayaka was also curious to know if he needed a hospital, but Iru kept trying to eat his face off while asking why he suddenly wanted to do something. After telling them to stop treating him like he had a terminal illness, he went outside to wait for Iru since she was the only one with enough time to spend on his new detective case. When she pulled up with her bike, he imagined both scenarios and knew he would be bricked the entire time, so he told her to go ahead and search for anything on Oji. When he eventually got there, she had found a paper from years ago showing that Oji was once into mountain climbing, but it wasn't exactly what Haotoru wanted. So they went up to the librarian and asked for a specific article around the day Oji saw that helicopter. After spending half an hour looking through the other stuff in the library, they finally got a compilation of old newspapers to look through, and Haotoru eventually got to a story about 2 climbers that got trapped the night before that day. He then took a seat with Iru and told her that Satoshi's story about him getting struck by lightning was likely because of his days as a mountain climber. He had also figured that Oji was interested in the helicopter flying over on that day because it meant the weather was good enough for a rescue mission to save the climbers that got stranded. Later on, they both started heading home, but Iru wanted to know why he was so curious about something that was truly none of his business. She low-key expected him to say something stupid like being bored, but he said it was his way of correcting the misconception he had around Augie simply being a brokey who was obsessed with choppers because he had never taken a ride on one. Realizing that the dark, low-budget Sherlock Holmes had a heart struck a chord in Iru's heart, but she stopped herself from saying something corny and wished him good night before heading home. The next day, Haotoru had a test and played a guessing game all the way to the end before heading to the clubroom with Iru and asking about her uncle's funeral. After telling him that it went well, she asked if he could go visit his grave with her soon, and he reluctantly agreed. She then thanked him for solving his case again and kept talking about how good he was at solving mysteries until he said it was no big deal and claimed to actually be a talentless weeb. She refused to accept his lack of self-confidence and tried to make him change his mind by listing out all the cases he had solved, but his chronic self-hatred was too deep, so he suggested coming up with a random case to prove just how worthless he truly was. After hearing that, she started looking for random things to cook up a mystery, but an announcement suddenly came on asking for a certain student who shopped at a store the previous day. Iru then told him to come up with a theory about why the student was called and gave him a note with the exact message their head teacher said on the announcement. As soon as he tried to come up with something, she went over to get a closer look and almost exchanged mouth juices with him. But being such inexperienced nerds made them both chicken out, so she grabbed a seat and listened as he pointed out the facts. The store in question was a stationery run by an old couple, and they primarily sold things for elementary school kids, so it didn't make sense that a high schooler went shopping there. Seeing as it could only be one student being called out, he was sure that they had probably done something wrong, which was why they were called to the staff room instead of a private meeting with the head teacher. At that point, Iru asked why he was suddenly taking the whole thing seriously if his plan was to prove that he wasn't that smart, but he said it was all a part of a grand scheme to show that he was really just a dust-brained loser who got lucky a few times. With that said, he went back to work and said it was weird that they didn't wait until the next day to make the announcement since most of the students had already gone home. That made him realize that it was likely a time-sensitive subject, which in turn meant that the student had likely committed a serious offense that could possibly get the police involved. Iru thought they could probably just be looking for someone matching a certain description, but Haotaru told her to stick to being a hottie with an empty skull since that would be impossible. After a lot of thinking, he said the student likely committed some kind of theft and felt bad afterward, so he probably wrote a letter apologizing to the old couple, who then submitted it to the police and led to the announcement being made. The only thing left to figure out was which crime could possibly cause someone to willingly give themselves up afterward. So Haotaru put his brain on overdrive and realized that they probably paid for something with fake money. When he told Iru, she suddenly got up in his face and kept reaching in right until their lips were inches away, but Mr. Alpha Virgin still didn't have the balls to do what was necessary, so they went back to solving their make-believe case. Iru still didn't understand how it all connected, so Haotaru took a minute to bring his brain power down to her elementary school level. He then explained that the student likely got the fake money from an older person and couldn't reject it, so he used it to buy something from the old couple and wrote a letter back out of guilt. With that, she decided to accept his theory and completely forgot that they were trying to prove how stupid he was in the first place. That weekend, Haotaru got the morning newspaper and saw that his little theory was spot on, from a story connecting the student's fake note to a bunch of gangsters printing fake money. Several days later, Haotaru and Eru ended up dealing with the effects of hypothermia after getting locked in a shed for some reason. Earlier that day, Haotaru got a call from her to ask if he had any plans for the New Year celebration, but all he wanted was to sleep, so she suggested visiting a shrine later that day. Without batting an eye, he agreed and threw on his best winter fit that night before she got dropped off and gave him instant brain freeze with her beauty. After exchanging greetings, she asked for a comment on her kimono, but part of his brain was still defrosting, so she led him up the stairs and gave him a bottle of sake she was meant to present to the shrine's caretakers as a gift. She then told him about all the asses she had to kiss as a way of protecting the relationships her family had built over the years. When they eventually met the shrine's caretaker, he welcomed them both before they got seated and waited until Chaho showed up to formally accept her good wishes. Watching their rich people ritual started messing with broke Haotaru's head, so Iru explained it in Broki terms to make him feel like he was one of them. After that, they went to see Mayaka, who immediately started complimenting everything Iru had on, and told them about her job to watch over the lost items so their owners would get them back after the celebrations. After a lot of chit-chat, Iru decided to draw a fortune and convinced Haotaru to get one as well, but while she got blessed, he received a shit ton of misfortune and regretted tagging along with her. Moments later, Iru tried to read the details of his curse, but Chaho kept pacing back and forth, so she stopped her to ask if everything was okay. After Kaho said one of the volunteers had messed with the supplies, she offered to get some more from the warehouse, and Haotaru decided to tag along again, clearly forgetting how bad that decision could be. For some reason, the wannabe detective led her into a shed and thought it was a warehouse until she explained what a warehouse looked like, right before they got locked in. With the cold being unbearable, he tried to call for help, but she covered his mouth and said it would be a bad look for her family if she were to be found alone in a shed with some delusional nobody. He decided not to take her words too seriously and suggested breaking out through a bunch of ways, but she still said it was a bad idea since it would be disrespectful to ruin a part of the shrine. In a matter of minutes, the cold started to become unbearable, and they suddenly heard someone near the shed, but it was just a volunteer picking up a lost item to drop off at Mayaka's station. Seeing that gave Haotoru an idea, so he broke off a bit of the shed and tossed Iru's napkin so they could take it back to Mayaka, who he hoped would be smart enough to see that it was a message. At the time, Satoshi had just pulled up and went to see Mayaka, who then showed him the napkin, but he said it was nothing. After waiting a few more minutes, Haotoru tossed his wallet with his misfortune reading tied around it as another sign, but all Satoshi found was a quarter he then used to get a fortune for himself. By then, Haotoru and Iru's vocal cords were too frozen to even call for help, so they apologized to each other for not realizing that their friends were numbskulls, but Haotoru suddenly got one last idea and started looking for a long rope. Iru then suggested using the rope holding up her kimono and thought Haotoru would see the blinding green light she was giving him. But he already knew she was trying to get freaky and refused because he knew his baby carrot would get frozen. After finding one tied to the shed's roof, he wrapped her purse and tossed it out. Thankfully, Mayaka finally realized that something was up. But Satoshi ended up being the one who realized what Haotoru had been trying to do. By then, they had both started saying their final prayers as the frostbite was getting critical, but Satoshi made it in time to save them. Days before Valentine, Mayaka was in the club room trying to learn how to make chocolate from scratch so she could impress Satoshi. But the torture techniques she had as a backup plan made Haotoru wonder why he got involved with such psychopaths. Afterwards, he started heading home and had just gotten to an arcade when Satoshi came out and asked for a game. While playing, Haotoru noticed that he wasn't aggressively trying to win like he once did in middle school and was even more surprised when Satoshi took the L and complimented his skills instead of going into a fit of rage. On the day of love, Haotoru woke up to a chocolate bar from his sister and kicked it into a corner of the room before heading to school. On the way there, Iru caught up with him to talk about how Mayaka's chocolate turned out and stopped him to say that her family showed love to the ones they cared about by giving them nothing. Realizing that she was basically trying to confess freaked him out for a bit, and she could feel it, so she changed her mind. Later on, Mayaka was at the manga club, so Iru went to the club room to watch over the chocolate while Haotoru was at the library waiting out a storm. At one point, she showed up to ask if he had seen Satoshi before heading back, but then she came back a few minutes later with him and said someone had stolen the chocolate. Haotoru tried to act like he didn't care as usual, but Iru didn't even have to work her magic before he folded and summoned his detective spirit. On the way up to the club room, they passed a member of the crafts club, and after Iru explained what happened in detail, Haotoru said he would have likely seen anyone who got off their floor. Unfortunately, the crafts guy had only seen the three of them, which meant the thief was still on the floor, so they went to the only other club that was still open. The moment their captain came out, Iru threatened to have them arrested, so the boys took over and explained the situation to her. She then asked the others in the club about it, but they all started laughing because they were loners who didn't even expect to see any chocolates. Moments later, they were back in the club room, but Iru was still a little jumpy and went to check the ladies' room while Haotoru hung back to think and finally figured it out. When Iru got back, he tried to tell her, but then Mayaka showed up and Iru told her what happened. For some reason, she wasn't as upset and told Iru not to worry too much before leaving, but Iru was already planning murder and tried to leave. Haotoru stopped her to say their thief was the other girl in the club they visited and promised to handle it on his own, so she left to catch up with Mayaka. Just after sundown, he started heading home with Satoshi and stopped at a bridge to ask for his bag, which he then handed back, claiming he knew it was Satoshi all along. He then asked why, and Satoshi explained that he was trying to switch to a new nonchalant personality that couldn't get obsessed with anything. The only problem was Mayaka because he knew accepting her chocolate would lead to him becoming a simp with no self-respect, and he seriously didn't want to disappoint Andrew Tate and the international community of Sigmas. Earlier on, Mayaka had also stopped Iru to apologize for playing dumb because she knew that Satoshi took the chocolate and just wanted to escape her charms. They were still both upset that he acted like they were stolen, but Iru felt better knowing the truth. Before leaving, Haotoru told Satoshi to stop lying to himself and went home to find the chocolate bar his sister gave him since that was all his lonely got for Valentine's. Months later, he got a call from Iru asking for his help with a shrine festival she was going to be a part of and broke his loner code for her again. Shortly after the call, he went to the shrine and was led to a room where a bunch of old geezers were fighting back their dementia to make sure everything was on point. When they mentioned processing through a bridge, Haotoru remembered seeing a construction van close to it on his way there and told them about it. They didn't believe him at first, since the construction company should have been informed of the festival procession. But after one of them came back with the bad news, they all went into a frenzy to figure out a solution. Moments later, a messenger called Hautharu to a room where Iru was getting all dressed up, and he patiently waited like an obedient slave while she gave him orders for the old geezers. After he went back to tell them, they completed the rest of the preparations and got him dressed like a medieval Japanese clown before Iru came out looking like the goddess of beauty. Hautharu's role was to protect her beauty from the sun, but that became the most difficult thing he had ever done because her beauty kept scrambling his brain until he saw Mayaka and Satoshi. After the procession, they took turns roasting him until Satoshi eventually went to get a drink, and Mayaka used that opportunity to thank him for the help with her chocolate. Later that day, he was by the porch trying to enjoy the peaceful silence, but Iru showed up and was curious about the whole construction company incident. At that point, Hautharu was too tired to act like he didn't care and told her that it likely had something to do with the guy that dressed him up. For some reason, he kept talking about the procession like it was this once-in-a-lifetime event when it happened every other year. The only thing that would make it special was the fact that they took a different route that led through a special tree, which would mean that he probably called the construction company and made them start their project on the bridge just to see the procession go through there. After playing detective, he started heading home, and she walked with him to talk about her future as the only heir to the family. She had to choose between controlling the family's farms and keeping the production steady or focusing on the finances to make sure they stay out of bankruptcy. Despite not really liking the fact that she was destined to remain in an old town with nothing but pretty flowers and overactive boomers, she wanted to make the most out of it. Hearing her talk so much about her goals in life made Hautharu realize that he had really become obsessed with her, but he still couldn't find the balls to own up to his own feelings and accepted that he might always be a spineless loner. Will Hautharu end up losing the love of his life to his own cowardice, or will Iru decide to wear the pants in the relationship and come clean about her feelings? That is it for this video. Leave a thumbs up if you liked it and subscribe to the channel for similar content. And as always, thanks for watching.